Hi, I'm Alex Vissink, a historian specialized in the Viking Age. When we think about Vikings, a familiar image often comes to mind: violent raiders, pagan enemies of Christianity, and ruthless destroyers of civilization. This image has been repeated in medieval chronicles, modern textbooks, television shows, and popular culture. Where did this image actually come from? And just as importantly, who created it and for what purpose was it created? In today's video, we're going to explore how medieval Frankish authors used a process known as othering to shape the Viking image, and how this strategy played a crucial role in defining Christian and Frankish identity in the early Middle Ages. And rather than asking whether Vikings were violent, as people often do, we'll be asking a different question, namely, why were they described the way they were? So first of all, we're going to delve a bit into the concept of othering. Othering is most famously associated with the scholar Edward Said in his work Orientalism. Said argues that Europeans constructed an imaged Orient as a way of defining themselves, really. This other was portrayed as irrational, uncivilized, immoral, and also dangerous, everything that the Europeans claimed not to be. Crucially, this process of creating the other or the Orient was not a neutral or an accidental process. These representations helped justify European dominance. By depicting non-Western societies as inferior or threatening, colonial violence and exploitation could be framed as necessary, even benevolent. So, in other words, the other or the Orient came to embody everything that the Europeans were not, and helped realize and justify the process of colonialism. It's important for our purposes is that this strategy of identity formation, as you can call it, through creating this type of contrast between us and them, is not unique to the modern world. The idea of defining who we are by emphasizing who we are not can be found much earlier, long before overseas empires and colonial rule. In the early Middle Ages, particularly during the 9th century, Frankish authors employed a similar narrative strategy when describing pagans. So they also used othering, in other words. Christian writers divided the world into two opposing camps, Christians and pagans. These categories were presented as internally uniform and fundamentally opposed to each other. Christianity was associated with order, morality, and civilization, while paganism was linked to chaos, violence, and moral corruption. Vikings actually became the most prominent, or one of the most prominent embodiments of this pagan other. They were described as savage, uncivilized, and inherently aggressive. Scholarship shows that Carolingian clerics often framed Viking raids in explicitly religious terms. Vikings were not simply human enemies, but they were instruments of divine punishment. In other words, their attacks were interpreted as God's response to the sins of the Franks, fulfilling biblical prophecy. At the same time, however, it also reinforced clerical authority. If Viking violence was God's punishment, then repentance, reform, and obedience to the church were the solutions. So, as a result of this, Vikings were consistently portrayed as pagan enemies of Christianity, violent, destructive, and morally corrupt. Yet, when we take a look at the historical evidence, it shows that religious boundaries were often porous, so people could move between these so-called boundaries. Pagans converted, for instance. Christians collaborated with the Vikings. Some Christians even joined the Vikings. And cultural exchange was common during this time. Despite this historical complexity, Frankish sources overwhelmingly maintained a crude binary distinction, so between us and them, the Christians and the pagans, in this case the Vikings. This simplification was not a failure of understanding the historical situation. It was a deliberate narrative choice by the Frankish authors. Depictions of the Vikings were never intended to offer an accurate description of pagan societies or interaction with Vikings. Their description served theological and ideological purposes. By portraying pagans as everything that the Christians were not, authors reinforced ideals of correct belief, behavior, and moral discipline. This process also helped define the limits of Christian community. The pagan or the Viking other functioned as some sort of mirror. By condemning pagan violence and immorality, Christian authors clarified what it meant to live a proper Christian life. And this is also something that became increasingly important during the political instability of the late 9th century. The Carolingian world was fragmenting, royal authority was weakening, and I'll talk about this in some upcoming videos. And the very meaning of Frankish identity, so Frankishness, was increasingly uncertain during this time. So it was in this context that the Viking author became a very powerful narrative tool. By portraying Vikings as absolute outsiders, Frankish writers drew boundaries about belonging. Important to mention here is the concept of the regnum Francorum, also translated the Frankish kingdom. But this was not just a political entity, but it was also a moral and religious one. To belong to the regnum Francorum meant to be Christian, disciplined, and obedient to the divine order. So the Viking author helped define who did not belong to this regnum Francorum. So it was really about redefining what Frankishness meant and also reinforcing this Frankish identity. In conclusion, the Viking image preserved in Carolingian sources tells us as much, if not more, about the Franks themselves as it does about the Vikings. By constructing a Viking author and distancing themselves from this Viking author, Frankish authors reinforced Christian belief, explained suffering, and stabilized identity during a period of profound political and religious uncertainty. And it is about understanding this process that reminds us that medieval sources are never neutral. They are shaped by fear, faith, and ideology. To truly understand the past, as we've seen in this video, we must ask not only what medieval authors wrote down, but why they wrote it down. Once again, thanks for watching, take care, and see you in another video.